Hi, I'm David Petersen, the creator of MouseGuard. I'm going to be doing some creator commentary in this video for the first issue ever of MouseGuard, which was Belly of the Beast. It's also the first chapter in the Fall 1152 series. Now, let me give you some background on this issue. I wrote and drew this and self-published the first issue in black and white originally. I used a print-on-demand service. The way that you can tell is from the covers is that the original version has a $3 price label up in the upper corner. And then when Archaea picked it up and decided to do a mini-series with me, the price information was taken off of the front cover and put onto the back with a barcode and the Archaea logo. The first issue was not subtitled anything about being part of a fall series. Every issue got its own title. I hadn't really thought of what the overarching connective tissue would be called for this series. But eventually when it did get collected into a hardcover format, it became Fall 1152. So, without further ado, here is the commentary page by page for the issue. Let's start with the cover. It's a full wraparound, and one of the reasons for that is the print-on-demand company that I used when I self-published this first issue back in 2005 had a pricing structure based on where you would put an ad for their printing company. I thought at the time it would seem very unprofessional or very amateurish to have that kind of an ad on the outside of the book, and so I opted for a slightly more expensive version where the ad is buried inside. But it meant that I got all this extra real estate. I got a full back cover for artwork. And to do that, I thought the way to exploit it, to get that first eye grabber, attention grabber kind of scene for the reader would be to do a wraparound, something cinematic, something like a key shot from a David Lean movie. I drew and inked this traditionally, and because the print-on-demand company had a pricing structure that I could afford for black and white interiors, color cover, I watercolored the cover because I didn't have to worry about the colors on the outside ever matching the colors on the inside. I also at the time wasn't very confident in my digital coloring skills, but I was more confident in watercolor. Although, that being said, one of the reasons that there's so much white on this cover is that I was in constant fear of muddying this thing up, of making it too saturated in color and going too far. The inside front cover of a comic book is normally dedicated to publisher info, crediting the creators, maybe some logo, design work, assets from previous issues, or bringing the reader up to speed on what happened in the issue before. But because this is the first issue of MouseGuard, there was no publisher when I started, and I was the only person creatively working on it. I decided instead to use this space kind of like the opening crawl of a Star Wars movie. This is my front-loading way of getting the exposition to the reader as quickly as possible so that I can then just get into the visual storytelling afterwards. I wrote this up to make sure two major points happened. One, that I described that there had been this historic event of a weasel war that had happened years before, and that is no longer the case, and then listing some attributes of what the skill set is for being a mouse guard. That they are pathfinders, escorts, weather watchers, and scouts. And then the control art here, the little spot illustrations. I can't remember if I drew that before or if I had them on hand, or if I drew them afterwards. But I needed some kind of visual interest and not just making this a full page of text. When I started on this issue of MouseGuard, I didn't know anything about writing or drawing comics really, and I had looked at lots of creative advice from working professionals, and one of the things that comic artists said that newbies needed to work on was storytelling, which from what I could tell boiled down to being able to tell the story if you stripped the words back away. So I gave myself the added challenge of not having any words, of just having to draw this with an outline, only knowing the context of what's happening in each panel, but no actual dialogue or narration. Now, this page is one of the exceptions. I actually wrote this down in long form pretty much as it appears here, which is this grain merchant explaining what the guard is and why it's important as we see him pedaling on with his grain across these different terrains. Now, to draw those different terrains, my wife and I were celebrating our first anniversary up in the Frankfort area of Michigan, and I took my digital camera and I held it against tree branches and really low on rocky footpaths and getting all these interesting angles and reference photos from a mouse's point of view. Now, page 2 was actually the first page of Mouse Guard that I ever actually drew. I can't remember why I drew them out of order, why I drew page 2 before I drew the others, but I definitely remember that this is the first page that I ever drew. To be able to draw these pages square, I had to get some square Bristol board, and in those days, you couldn't just buy square sheets of Bristol. You had to buy larger sheets and trim them down. And I was using 14-inch by 17-inch pads, and I thought the way to save time in terms of trimming them down is if I just trimmed off the bottom and made it only 14 inches high, it was already 14 inches wide, and I'd have a perfect square. I'd only have to do one cut per sheet. And I drew this page at that size, at that 14-inch by 14-inch, and it was impossible to scan. Not only was it a lot of space to have to fill and put all the textures in, it was really hard to scan. It was way bigger than my scanner bed, and I had to scan it in parts, 4 different parts, and then reassemble it. And I decided after that I'm never going to do a page that big again. And my scanner bed could accommodate something more like 12 by 12. And so I was trimming those pads down to 12 by 12 from that point on. This splash page is kind of an unusual choice, but I did it because in the previous page we had all these small shots of a mouse within nature. We had a mouse more at mouse scale. And this time I wanted to bring the reader right in and treat the character like an equal, and so that we could really see his struggle. We could see how hard it is for him to pull this grain cart over the terrain and make this trip from Root Wallow to Barkstone. For the grain, I avoided drawing all those little individual pieces of grain, a decision I now regret because I think it doesn't look as good as it could. But I just drew that outside contour. I think I was worried that it was going to get too busy, which is a valid concern. But instead of when I colored the issue eventually, I just made a Photoshop brush of kind of a piece of grain and then painted over and over and over until I got that buildup of texture so that it actually looks like it's a 3D object instead of just a weird shape. By page 3, I've already gone against a guideline that I was setting for how to break up my pages. I wanted most of the pages to be broken into a 9-panel grid, or at least referencing the 9-panel grid layout, which means breaking up your panels on the 1/3 division lines, both vertically and horizontally. Here I've broken it into quarters. One of the reasons for that was I wanted this sequence to be kind of like an animation where the background doesn't really change, but we're getting these very quick beat-by-beat moments of the character, and only the character kind of slightly changes. And I had about 4 beats for that. Now, obviously, there's that little offset panel at the bottom, but that was the pacing. And we have the mouse here, the grain merchant, taking a little break and suddenly being overcome by a shadow that catches his attention. Now, to do the shadow, I didn't want it to allude to the snake too heavily, even though there's obviously a snake on the cover, and the last panel kind of on this page kind of gives something away. So I held my hand up over the page, over the original artwork, and cast a shadow using my hand, and then traced onto the page the cast shadow and filled that in with all the cross hatching. Unfortunately, that means now whenever I look at this page, maybe that'll be true for you as well now, I see my hand. I don't see a snake at all. I don't even see something vaguely snakish. I think I went too far the other direction in trying to not make it look like a snake. On page 4, the top panel is supposed to resemble something like a Japanese woodblock nature print. I wanted there to be a lot of open space, and then also this kind of leaf pattern and design, which I did by cross-hatching. And I left the open space so that I had lots of room for the title of the book, the title of this issue, and the credits. But it's the bottom 3 panels that I think are the important part here. And this is something that I really wanted to make sure that I conquered when I did this issue. We're meeting our heroes, and I wanted to get right to the interesting thing, and I wanted to make sure that their characters and personalities shone through right here from the very first minute that we meet them. And in the panel with Liam, we learn that he is still learning. He is asking questions. He is the new guard mouse. He doesn't have as much experience, and so vicariously the reader can learn through him. He's asking Kenzie questions. And then in the middle panel, we see Kenzie standing very confidently. He has information. He knows what's going on, and he's leading this patrol. And then in the last panel, we have Saxon getting his personality across. He's angry. He's impatient. He's complaining. And he's ready for action. He has his hand on his sword. Page 5 continues this. Right away, we get Saxon giving dialogue where he's saying that he wants to be pushing on. He wants to push for action. Whereas Kenzie is more interested in pausing, taking a rest, and trying to find information. Information is more important than action to Kenzie. And then in the panels 2 and 3, we see Liam is the one actually doing the grunt work. Also kind of a symbol of him being both a workhorse and the new recruit who can get pushed around into doing the less desirable tasks that Saxon and Kenzie may not want to do or feel are beneath them. This page also is a mirror, or not a mirror, but a 180-degree turn of the layout from the previous page. And something that I started to become kind of obsessed with as I was working on these issues was to try to mirror. My first reaction for what to do for a facing page was to try to mirror or rotate whatever the layout was before. If I could get that to work with what the story was, I felt like that was a huge success, and that would be my first option when trying to figure out how to lay out the next page. For page 6, the script, more like an outline really, had this scene listed as find cart and grain, no mouse, realize predator is a carnivore. And that's how vague my outline and script were when I was actually working on these pages. Panel 1, we have the mice investigating the cart. Again, I was trying to get the personalities across and really make sure that they were visually being told Saxon here is on guard. He's ready for action. Liam is slightly pushed to the background, where not just in this first panel, but also the next several, Kenzie is all about the investigation. He's about finding out the information and dissecting why something is the way it is. That last panel, where you can barely even see the mice, they're just dots, is something that I realized I needed here just to try to shift up the different panels and the camera angles and make sure that visually interesting things were happening. But I found that with Mouse Guard, every now and then I have to pull way back and show the landscape so that the reader doesn't forget that in the bigger panels where the mice are more of a human scale and visually, that when I pull back, you remember mice are very small. The scale is important. These are only little tiny mice. Page 7 is a mirror of the previous page's layout, something that I mentioned was important to me as I was going forward trying to figure out what 2-page spreads would look like. I liked the idea of them having this symmetry, and in this case it is a direct mirror. And then all the panel choices here are about switching the camera angles and trying to make sure that I'm visually telling a story that's interesting. I knew about the shortcomings of drawing hero shots in panels, or showing medium shots or talking heads. It was something that bored me as a comic reader. So to really push myself, I made sure that I dramatically shifted the camera angle in that panel 1. I focused on something other than the mouse heads in panel 2. I showed just nature and landscape in panel 3, and then got back to something more like a hero shot in panel 4. The idea of camping out and keeping the first watch is mentioned in panel 2 there, and then obviously they're camping out and staying down for the night, but staying vigilant is something that came directly from my experience both in the Boy Scouts and from playing role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. That's part of the makeup of this book, I think, are those two things, my Boy Scout time and playing role-playing games with friends. On page 8, it is now morning. Liam's waking up. Saxon and Kenzie have wandered off, and Liam is unaware of what they have found. Now, by doing that, having Liam not knowing what's going on, it allows Kenzie to explain not only to Liam what they've found, but explain to the reader. This was something that I found the Liam character to be very important for. He is the reader's gateway into this world. That way, when Saxon or Kenzie explain something to their young recruit, it doesn't come off as artificial dialogue between two experienced characters where I'm just trying to pad out information to the reader. Saxon being the tracker here in panel 4 is an idea that when trying to come up with skills for each individual mouse, I thought that might be a good one for Saxon. I come back to it in the 4th issue of the fall series. And visually here, I think the personalities of the characters are coming in, which are aggression, wisdom, and to some degree defense. Liam isn't really so much my defense character. Rand, for those of you who are fans and know the characters a little better, Rand was the defense character, but I still think those 3 tenets, those core tenets of what the Guard is, come through in this, and Liam makes a good substitute Rand in this panel. The outline notes for page 9 said, "Pickup grain trail leads to holes in the ground." And I filled a lot of the page with kind of that reveal of there being a hole in the direction of those drag marks where the grain was headed. But it's the bottom panel that I'm a little more proud of. In the bottom panel, there's this slow reveal of the snake. And part of that's done by the sound effect also hiding with the snake, the hissing, the continuous S's going behind those maple leaves. And the leaves were meant to be a visual cue. I don't know how well I pulled this off, because in the top panel, the leaves are behind them. So when we see the snake going through the maple leaves, my hope was that you understand that the snake was behind the characters here, and I don't know how well I pulled that off. Page 10, this is more of that slow reveal. I still haven't shown you the whole snake, and I wanted to hold off on showing the snake in all of its grandeur. So we're getting segments of the snake's skin here, and this slow reveal allows each character to react, as well as the sound effect to kind of permeate the background. Saxon and Kenzie are certainly taken by surprise, but it's Liam who ends up being the one who's the most vulnerable and kind of traumatized, as you can see in this last panel. Visually, I was also trying to lead your eye, the reader's eye, from Saxon's hand and kind of the angle of his sword down to Kenzie's staff, and then that you'd follow Kenzie's head shape and the direction of his eyes down to the loop around Liam and get you into that 3rd panel. Page 11, my first big action scene, I decided to give a vertical thrust, which meant making a 90-degree rotated version of the layout from the last page. Page 10 was all 3 horizontal panels. This is now 3 vertical panels. And here we have Saxon doing what Saxon does. He's attacking. We have Kenzie trying to hold, stall, and plan. And Liam is more concerned with safety and wants to run. The tree in the background of panel 3 was something that I was worried that if I drew in detail, it wouldn't get pushed back far enough into the background. We wouldn't see it as a distance thing. So I did the a crosshatchy pattern to try to show the shape of a tree with a knot hole, but not make it look like it was on the same plane as Liam. For page 12, the first panel here is a cutaway. I really couldn't think of a better storytelling method to show them inside of the tree, show that the space that they were crawling through was too narrow for the snake to get in, and that we could see that the snake was practically on their heels, than to do this cutaway. Again, with the dialogue, which I added in later, but I had an idea of what they were going to be saying as I was drawing it. That the character personalities were coming through again. Kenzie is planning, Saxon is wanting a fight, and Liam is inexperienced. He doesn't understand. That last panel in the outline is only written as Liam expresses fear instead of, "Have you lost your mind? There is no way we could have defeated that beast, not now or later." On page 13, top panel is now this inspirational moment where Kenzie is trying to get Liam to understand a key tenet of what the mouse guard is. So Kenzie is leading with wisdom. He explains that this phrase that he's about to utter is carved into the wall at Lochhaven. So even though I haven't shown Lochhaven, my goal here was to put some world building in there. I think this is the first time that Lochhaven is actually mentioned in the book and gives you a sense of this larger world. The motto, "It matters not what you fight, but what you fight for," was never intended to be so important, like series-wide. I was literally just writing for the issue. But after I wrote it, it kind of felt like it was something. Like I could tell after I wrote it, it was more important than I had intended. And it reminded me of like a mouse guard version of Stan Lee's "With great power comes great responsibility." I got a chance to share that line with Stan in an elevator at San Diego one year. And when I told him the line, he actually kind of perked up and went, "Ooh, that's good," which I'm very proud of, that phrase that's carved into Lochhaven actually got the Stan Lee seal of approval. The cutaway panel where we see a fragment of the saying was definitely inspired by Mike Mignola and the way he would show architecture or ornamentation in Hellboy as a way of making a visually interesting distraction for the reader, something other than just, the characters. And that panel also provides a visual pause so that the reader doesn't really know how much time has passed between panel 1 and panel 3, when now Liam is ready to actually go face this mouse. The hatching on the mice in the last panel to show kind of light and dark was still something I was trying to figure out. I didn't know how much of that would distract or be too busy, and I was trying to find a visual style. I hadn't quite decided on it. I didn't know that I was going to be coloring this issue when I drew that, and now I handle things differently drawing mouse guard than I did then. The script or outline for page 14 says, "They spot the nest and sneak out and destroy the eggs," which is what they're going to do here on page 14. The characters are coming back out of the tree now that Liam has gotten some of his courage. The cross-hatching that's in the background there on panel 1 is to try to get a subtle out-of-focus effect for the background foliage. I was worried at this time about putting too much detail in, and especially on what would look like one plane, instead of getting the full depth of field. It's something that took a lot of years of building up both a visual vocabulary for in ink and then also in color as Mouse Guard has gone on. The rest of the page, we have Saxon and Kenzie, realizing that the hole is full of eggs, and them speaking offspring at the same time was something that I wanted to be a little more obvious. I have that word balloon a little too tight to the top of the panel in panel 3. I wish it was a little lower and we could see more of the tails. They are like brothers. They're not actually brothers, but Saxon and Kenzie are supposed to be kind of two sides of the same coin. And I like the idea that they're coming together, that even though they disagree, this is something on which they both have an immediate understanding that the offspring, that these eggs are trouble. And then the last panel, we have Saxon classically leaping before he looks. I mean, I know he looked, but, jumping into action before he's determined if that plan makes sense. And then Kenzie planning and having to chase after Saxon. He has to now come up with a contingency plan on the spot and jump in to make sure that his friend doesn't get in over his head when it comes to trouble. Page 15, the top panel looks a lot less odd in black and white, this action shot. Originally, like I said, I had drawn this for black and white publication and then came back and colored it for Archaea. I was worried about the splatter of the eggs and the babies and potentially whatever kind of blood or fluid inside the eggs could be coming out could look too gory. And so when I was coloring it, I painted all the splatter blue. It looked a little otherworldly. I think it also gets a little alienish. I also totally regret that the scale for the snake babies is wrong. It's not appropriate, and they don't really even seem all that threatening. They don't seem all that scary, other than they kind of look like alien tadpoles with all the blue eye gore coming out. The last panel here, we have Liam wandering off as Saxon and Kenzie work together as a duo down in the hole. I wish I had a reason for him doing that. I mean, it's what the plot called for. I needed him to get a little bit away so that what happens next could happen to him. But I always regret that it looks like he's kind of abandoning his post. On page 16, the reasons for Liam wandering away in the last panel are now revealed, at least from a plot standpoint. I wanted to not be so blatant that he's discovered the grain merchant or where the grain merchant is, but I have this callback texture as a way of doing that. The mesh and weave of the hat. We see it kind of in silhouette in panel 1 and then a much more definitive version of it in panel 2, but it's still subtle, and some readers might not have noticed that that's what that is. Of the 4 panels on the page, 3 of them have a mouse in it, have Liam in it, and I tried to make sure that I was showing each one of them at a slightly different scale. The subtle S hiss coming out of the hole in panel 3 was again a way of me trying to be subtle, trying to show that something was coming, try to give the reader a little bit of a sense of doom that I think is then definitely established by that last panel. By panel 4, the tall one feels like doom is coming. I wanted the reader to be shouting, don't go in there, to Liam. And on page 17, doom has arrived. This big splash page is finally the reveal of the snake. This is the most iconic fight scene in Mouse Guard. I've been doing Mouse Guard for a number of years. I've had them fight all kinds of different predators, and the one that people comment on the most and are reminded of the most and say, oh, that time when Liam fought the snake, that's the one that sticks in their heads. I think this reinforces the idea of little versus big, this panel. I wanted to make sure that there was enough splash, so there was plenty of room for the snake, so I could show a sense of scale. I also wanted this to be the first time we really saw the snake in full. There are parts where we saw his head, there are parts where we saw his body, but this is the point where we see almost all of the snake, and it's against Liam. And Liam standing there, inexperienced as we know from the rest of the issue, and with that sword. I was worried when drawing this panel about not having the hero showing his face. But ultimately, I think you know exactly who the character is. We've seen a whole issue of Liam's face. So now getting to see the villain and getting to see just how dwarfed the hero is way more important than the reaction shot. The snake here, I referenced a black rat snake, which I'll talk more about in subsequent pages. On page 18, we do get that hero shot, that reaction shot from Liam. The importance of having him remember the thing that Kenzie told him was something that I struggled with how to fit that in, and I decided ultimately to have it running through the background. I did the color scheme different for the phrase on this page, and that's to show that it's more abstract. This is going through his mind. This is not a literal version of Liam standing in front of that wall or that carving. Getting Liam to look angry was hard. The way that I had drawn the mice made it a little difficult to play with their expressions, and I ultimately think that this version of Liam looks more like an angry cat than an angry mouse. But it's a panel that people comment on that they really love that expression out of Liam, and I think it gets across that he's angry. Why a black rat snake? And it's because they're not poisonous. Liam couldn't do this trick without the risk of being poisoned. The trick of he's decided to just go for the gusto. It's the only way he can really attack and stand a chance of defeating this snake is to get it in a weak spot. So he risks all, tries to get to that weak point, and climbs into his mouth and stabs the snake inside up through the skull and defeats the snake. This whole page, the outline and script just said, Snake and Liam clash, Liam prevails. In the last panel, to try to reinforce that the snake has died, the dark part of the snake's eye I did in cross hatching, and then when I did a color version of it, I made sure that instead of it being black, it printed in a color, and it's slightly faded, like the light has gone out of the snake's eye. Now, from page 19 on, there is no more script or outline. I was making this up as I went. I was trying to round out and come up with the end, because the last thing I wrote was that Liam prevailed that snake battle. I needed to get Saxon and Kenzie to realize what had happened, and so these 3 panels are about that. Immediately, Kenzie is the one who knows something. He's the one who heard something. So having Kenzie be the knowledgeable one is important to me here. The abstract falling coil shape of that snake in panel 2 with the dead eye is something that I love. I like that his head is so low, and that thud is really felt since the rest of the body is still kind of elevated, like the snake really fell to the ground. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. And then cutting back to Saxon and Kenzie, we still don't know Liam's fate. We don't know if he's alive or dead until after the page turn. Page 20 starts with this line from Saxon, we turn around and you're inside a snake, which still cracks me up. It was something I think I just wrote on the fly as I was putting in the final dialogue. Liam's muffled speech is just my own scribbles that I think I did in the margin or maybe on a scrap sheet of paper and scanned in. But ultimately it meant he's alive. Liam's still alive. And then panel 2, we have Saxon cutting open the snake, possibly on Kenzie's orders, and then finding the remains of the missing merchant. Now, this is as gory as I wanted to go. There is blood on Liam. He looks a little soggy from being inside of the snake's mouth. But that's as far as I wanted to go. I didn't want to show too much of the gore. Jeremy Bastian, who was a good friend of mine, creator of Cursed Pirate Girl, he was around when I was drawing this a lot. And Jeremy really wanted me to show the inside shot of the snake. He wanted me to show that merchant all kind of half digested and coiled up. We wanted me to show what the stakes were, how dangerous the world is for mice. And I ended up going more with the Hitchcock approach. It wasn't so much that I was looking at this as an all-ages book or I was worried about offending an audience. It was more about who I was as a storyteller. And I felt like I had more mileage out of seeing the reactions of Saxon, Kenzie, and Liam in this panel too, and that their reaction informs the reader of what is inside of the snake. And that then it's the reader's imagination filling in that gap, and that the reader's imagination is always going to be better than what I would have drawn. The last panel on page 20, we have a quick grave marker that the characters have made for the grain merchant. Liam again doing the grunt work, carrying the cart, and then some banter between Saxon and Kenzie, trying to show that this is all routine, that Liam is the one being contemplative, and they're just going about this like it's another day. Also, Rand being mentioned in the dialogue between Saxon and Kenzie was another world building thing and an homage to try to incorporate Rand, who was part of the original trio in my original concept of Mouse Guard, trying to incorporate him into the first issue. Page 21 starts with the mice and the landscape in silhouette. Just something visually different. Some of that was to switch things up. Some of it was also to kind of push along the idea that maybe daytime is fading into evening. And knowing that the bottom panels on this page were going to be close-ups. And I was going to get a chance to show the detail and kind of echo the introduction panels that I had shown at the beginning of the book. So the top panel gave me a little bit more freedom to be abstract and show them just in silhouette with little white dot eyes. Now, originally, the story ended on the previous page. I had no idea if I was going to get to do more Mouse Guard stories, if I ever was going to do Mouse Guard stories, and I just was trying to wrap up the story of the snake, defeating the snake and finding the merchant. But with this page, I decided I needed to add in a hook. I needed to make this part of a larger plot and a larger story. That way, if I ever got the chance to do more, I already had it built in. So here, Kenzie reveals that he's found this map, and that the map is part of a location, that they are headed to Barkstone. Not the map is of Barkstone, but they knew he was headed to Barkstone. And that name of Barkstone is not because I knew what Barkstone was, but because that's where I had listed the grain merchant as heading to in the early pages. I had no map. I had no greater sense of what the mouse territories looked when I wrote and drew this issue. And then they have a reason to go to Barkstone, and that's that they have to figure out what was going on, because the grain merchant was a mouse trader. And then I also needed to write in a little bit of retconning as to why Kenzie hadn't shared this info earlier, because he would have found it back in the early pages when they're searching the grain, he says in panel 3. And it's truthfully because I didn't know that this was going to happen when I wrote and drew those earlier pages. But here he gives the excuse that he figures that if they had found the merchant alive, that Saxon probably would have lost his temper and killed him. Now, this line goes further into our understanding of Saxon as a character. And again, we have his hand on his sword like we did in the introductory panel for him. On page 22, we have the map on this third splash page of the issue. It's the map of Lochhaven, kind of showing a floor plan of the ins and outs and where everything is on the inside. I had no idea what Lochhaven was going to look like, and I didn't have the time to actually do architectural drawings for Lochhaven. And so I just digitally cobbled together a few floor plans of medieval castles and towers that I could find online. I borrowed heavily from a castle called Crac de Chevalier in Syria and put them all together. I totally regret doing it this way. I hate this map image. It bears no visual similarity to what Lochhaven would eventually look like in issues 5 and 6 when I eventually drew it, both from the interior and the exterior. In a Legends of the Guard story, I had Dirk Shearer do a tale that's meant in some ways to discredit the accuracy of this map because, like I said, it's not accurate. And that was to further the idea that Alistair of Barkstone, husband to the owner of the Junali Inn, was the printer who made this map and made copies unwillingly. And so he put in flaws on purpose to try to thwart the Midnight's army. Maps of Lochhaven are clearly not to be shared with mice who are not guard mice, something that Kenzie implies here in this last piece of dialogue. For page 23, I had to fill out the page count of issue 1. I didn't have enough story pages built up, and I had gotten to the end of my story. So I needed something to end with, and I opted for an all-black page with a little snake skeleton down in the corner and the end, or end, in type. To do this, I actually drew the skeleton in black ink and then inverted the image digitally for the printing. And for page 24 of the issue, I featured a pinup by Guy Davis. I met Guy through selling him a sculpture that I made of the Tin Woodsman on eBay. And then I later followed up with him at the Motor City Comic Con, my local convention. This was the first time I ever had someone else draw one of my mouse characters, and it was a huge thrill, especially that it was Guy. I was a big fan of Guy's work, his work on BPRD and some of the stuff that he had done through Caliber. And he was just so encouraging. It was really nice to have him do this piece for me. And as a thank you, I actually gave Guy the original inks to page 2. That was that first page of Mouse Guard that I ever drew that was larger than all the rest, the one that was on 14 by 14. Guy did this in ink and then used a gray marker to add in the tones. It was done in grayscale because at the time this was going to be printed in black and white, and there was no need for it to be in color. Guy was also generous enough to give me the original of this in exchange for that first page of Mouse Guard that I ever drew. And that's the first issue of Mouse Guard, which is collected in fall 1152, available from Archaea. If you enjoyed that one, please leave me some comments in the comments below, the comment section below. Let me know what I didn't answer for you or what you would like answered in future videos like this one. Thank you very much for watching.